I'm almost never the person that remembers that. Welcome to this webinar. We're going to be talking about how to use logic models to communicate what, how, and sometimes the why of whatever it is that you are wanting to do. So here is sort of an overview of how the next hour is going to be structured. I'm going to start by talking about what is a model? Why are they useful? We'll then move into talking about different formats and structures. Matt and I have some overlapping and then some complementary expertise and experience. So I am just as excited as I hope you are to sit and listen from his experience. And then we'll go into talking about strategies for developing, explaining, and writing logic models. The purpose of them, as a spoiler alert, is to communicate what you're doing. Right. And so we communicate in education in multiple different ways. So we need to tailor our approaches. And then we'll end with a Q&A and some resources that we have curated. If you have resources that you have found helpful, please put them in the chat and Deidre will collate these and then we will add them to the slides when we share them out. All right, so it looks like we had a wide variety of feelings, and right, all feelings are okay, right? It's what we do with them. And so sometimes it's good to check in and think, what's your mindset as you're approaching something? So we're gonna start with the what and why of logic models. And I really liked this cartoon I found, why? It's like you give us money and I save the world, right? And then I have all the teachers we need and everyone knows how to do math or whatever. That's a little too simple. So what a logic model theory of change is, theory of change, think about logic model, theory of change is an umbrella, is under that umbrella. And you think of it as the roadmap of a relationship between your planned work and the intended results, what you want to happen. And so we talk about those in inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and raise your hand or give a thumbs up if you engaged in these activities and inputs this morning. I still have mine. So the emphasis in a logic model theory of change is that it's a graphic illustration of a relationship between programs, resources, activities, and intended effects, right? And from these grant evaluators, John McLaughlin and Gretchen Jordan, I really like the way that they describe it, where they say a program, because sometimes, especially if you're a doc student or a researcher, you're like, well, I'm not doing a program. I need to write a grant or do a dissertation. And they say that a program can be thought of as a hypothesis. So if we implement this thing, then expected results are going to follow. So we have this if-then assumption or logic. And what a model does is models it, makes it visual so that we can sort of unpack that hypothesis, find where the misconceptions are, what are the assumptions, so we can make them explicit. And then we evaluate and refine, evaluate and refine. So it's not just about a program. You can insert in the blank. We can use this for a grant. It can represent a dissertation. Ideally, then your dissertation is going to be more along the lines of your program of work or your initial research line, right? So that we aren't, no one study, especially no dissertation, will solve all of the problems and reach all of the outcomes that you want. And so for me, going back to the logic model goes okay, I don't have to do everything in this one study. Here's the one step I'm taking, and explicitly here are the steps I'm not taking, but they're like my little parking lot of things that I might do in the future, which is really great. And that's what people want to hear about in job talks. Or it could just be, what your research study. So you fill in the blank, whatever research endeavor you are moving towards. It's a graphic illustration of the relationships between those things.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, please.
I was going to say, it really resonated with me when you were talking about how this process can help you kind of zone in on what you really want to study at a specific time. Because I actually have my PhD students make theories of change logic models kind of early on in their programs. And every single time, there's far more captured in that model than is possible for one person to do in a single study or even in a series of studies. So I just think many of you, I think in the room might be in PhD programs. I think this is, just want to emphasize what a wonderful tool this is to kind of get the landscape of what you want to study and maybe narrow down on what's actually manageable in a small chunk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we, even those of us who've been doing this for a long time, and we can sit and, you know, the summer is a magical time of thinking of what, you know, oh, look at all the things we could do. My sister likes to joke that I'm a kite flying up high and I need someone to hold the strings to keep me on the ground. And I think a little bit going back to your models that you've co-developed with the other people involved in this work can help us kind of stay grounded and keep, you know, the main thing. It helps to make sure that we have alignment between our planned work and our intended results. As you move forward into actually implementing a project, you want to make sure there's alignment between your enacted work and the results that you're seeing. Often models are required by funders. And so that's one reason of like, why, because you have to, but it is beneficial. We can use them to integrate some of the conceptual elements of implementation research, especially if you're working in applied contexts. If you have a multi-phase research design, something like mixed methods that might have multiple phases and components that inform each other. And it promotes the transparency, rigor, openness, specification, reproducibility of our work. We want to be able to use it to plan, then communicate internally and externally what we're doing and why. And then we use this as a framework for evaluating, because we should be evaluating each of our activities to see if they met our planned outcomes. So we have a triangle. And how much do we love triangles in special ed? So I like to talk about the alignment triangle. And so we want to make sure we have alignment behind what it is we're doing, what are our activities, what are we investing, how we are doing it as far as our processes, and then why. And when we have alignment between these things, only then is our evaluation actually going to be meaningful and helpful. Just like if we're thinking of a teacher implementing an intervention, if it's not done with fidelity or if it's not done as intended, then the resulting student data is called into question. And then I found this cartoon on another presentation by George. It's attributed at least to George E.P. Box, where he says, essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Right. And so he was a British statistician, and he was not talking about logic models, but more about statistical models. But I think that the quote and the intent still holds true, that no model is going to have every single detailed aspect. In fact, if you think it does, it's kind of like an outfit. You might need to take a couple things off. Too many accessories to it that you've lost clarity. But having said that, if a model cannot describe the reality, you want it sort of close enough to what's going to be helpful to you. So yes, the answer is you need a model. They're often required by funders. They help develop agreement among stakeholders of the what and the how of the program. And then they provide this transparency, rigor, openness, specification, and reproducibility, all things that we are working towards in an effort of open science. Okay, so we're going to move into talking about formats and structures. Spoiler alert, they look lots of different ways. And so I'm going to go through sort of the basic components and give some examples. And so we'll map. So we're going to try and embed some examples along the way. The first thing that, even led Matt and I's planning conversation was like, what is the difference between a logic model and a theory of change? A logic model is descriptive. So it's going to describe the logical sequence of a program, grant, dissertation, research study, insert the blank, intended outcomes. So it's this if-then. series of statements. So if we provide or do X, the result will be Y. A theory of change is a type of logic model. It just goes a step further. It is explanatory. So it includes what we call the causal mechanisms to show why components are expected to result in outcomes. So if we provide X, A is going to support or hinder the result of Y. So if, then, because. So if we provide students with visual supports, then they will be more independent in self-monitoring because of self-determination theory or what have you. So there are many different types, and some are hybrids. We're really just going to focus on two in this hour. One is the outcomes approach model. So sort of the like basic logic model, I think, that I've personally seen most often, where it's going to connect the resources and activities, so your planned work, with the results and outcomes, and may even have that broken up over time. Then there's the theory approach model, which is a theory of change, and you're going to find those more often in a research grant proposal and driving research projects. There is also an activities approach, and then implementation research logic model. This is emerging out of the emphasis on implementation science. So Matt will talk about a few aspects of that just as a teaser, and then we have a lot of resources at the end if you want to learn more. So there are several different purposes and uses of logic models that are why you want it, and what you're doing is going to inform what it includes, right? So it can be focused on program evaluation, which again, program can be grant, it can be degree program, it can be intervention, it can be a summer transition institute. It helps you to then choose how you're going to evaluate your sample, what data sources are you going to include, development of the data collection instruments, analysis and dissemination, because you are outlining all of those things, how that work is going to happen in the plan. It also can support a program of research where you define the logic, or you clearly explain what components are going to lead to what and why. That then improves the precision of your research questions, or can determine the alignment of your research questions with your actual intended outcomes, helps to define the features of a study. And as Matt said, also what are not going to be the features of the study, right? So things that we could do, but not right now. It can guide development of your measurement, future adaptations, and clarify some of the effects. So here is the sort of most bare bones component of most logic models. They can have different, it doesn't have to be rectangles. It doesn't have to be black and white, but I tried to make it simplified as possible. So you have your overall problem statement, and then you have resources, activities, that's your planned work, and then you link that with your outputs, outcomes, and impact, the results you want. And at the bottom, or somewhere, you identify what assumptions you are making in this work. So many people want to, Taylor Swift reference number 2, for those of you counting at home. Many people want to start with the problem statement. It's like, here's what's going on that I'm going to solve. But our friend Rob Horner strongly encourages us to begin with the outcome in mind. So we want to begin with the end. What is the outcome and impact? So rather than being focused on a problem, it's what do you wish were true? What is the outcome, the socially significant outcome that you wish for this program of research or this grant or what have you to achieve? Those outcomes need to be important, not just to you, important to others, reasonable and realistic, considering your resources and activities, which we'll get to. And they can be short-term and long-term. You can choose to break it up that way or not. And then we also want to think about the impact. So what is the outcome long-term of this implementation? I think a benefit in delineating your short-term and your long-term or impact is it helps make your logic model more realistic. right? So while like, yes, we all want to save the world, right now I am making sure that teachers know how to support vocabulary knowledge. So that impact is that desired outcome. That is really your project goal, right? It's what's driving, it's the need. It can be related to the problem statement, and it can be at different levels. Could be a societal level, like regarding beliefs and belonging for people with disabilities within their communities. It could be systems level, related to maybe how schools implement and support inclusion of people with disabilities, to the individual level, thinking about, you know, the teachers who have engaged in a certain training project will maintain and support others to use culturally sustaining practices. Next, we kind of like move back, right? So once we've thought about like, what is it that we're hoping to achieve? What do we want to see? Now, what is it that this program or activity is actually going to do and measure, right? So the outcomes impact, that's more like people level. The output is your program. So it can be quantified in some way. We can even quantize our qualitative data, and it can be directly compared and aligned to activities. If you'll notice, we're working backwards. This is, any of my students know, this is the way we go. We always, as you talk about it, as you write about it, we go this way. It's my recommendation. And so next we have the activities. So what are you actually going to do in order to produce those outputs? And we may kind of have to go back and forth between activities and resources. All of this is somewhat iterative. When you have the activities identified, you want to identify what they are. So are there certain processes you're going to use, tools, interventions you're going to develop and implement, trainings, and then thinking about how am I going to evaluate that? Is it going to be, you know, formatively evaluated at the end of every semester? Is it more of a summative evaluation by an external evaluator? Do you have indicators or measures and data sources? All of that detail may not, likely is not, going to go onto your sort of overall logic model. But in the creation of this, you're thinking through those things, right? So there should be a link between the logic model and maybe another appendix that has the evaluation plan or the project management plan. We can also think about the outputs as the work that's performed. So I said this, and who it's going to reach. Finally, the resources are those tangible and intangible contributions. Sometimes you might see this as investments, use that word instead, that enable activities and strategies. So here's what we want to do, our activities. How can I make sure that I have the appropriate resources necessary in order to enact? So those could be tangible or intangible: people, time, expertise, partnerships. So when we read a logic model, and Matt and I'll do this with a few additional examples, it's all a series of if-then statements, okay? So it's, for example, we have these resources that are needed to carry out a program. If you have access to these resources, then you can use them to accomplish a planned activity. If you accomplish your planned activities, then you will hopefully deliver the intended amount, product, service, reach, what have you. If you accomplish your planned activities to the extent you intended, meaning like you satisfy the outcomes, then your participants will benefit in these wonderful ways. If these benefits to participants are achieved, then certain changes in the communities or systems may occur. Right. And so you can take this, this lovely language, and I have a link to this in the resources from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's Guide to Developing Logic Models. So when you are then writing about them, then you can just fill in the blank. So instead of access to them, specify what is access to them, specify each component. And then finally, want to make sure that we're recognizing and making explicit our assumptions. So assumptions can be your project's beliefs about participants, staff or program. It can be sort of, if you're in a partnership, maybe both the school district and the university have these beliefs, assumptions, or priorities. So we want to just take a step back and think, like, what do we know and what is being assumed? Maybe does one person think something that someone else does not? And so that can, early on in whatever planning process you're in, can help to have some really great and necessary conversations. So I have a couple example logic models that I will walk through that has like very much traditional structure. This is from Syracuse University. They have PowerPoint slides on a similar topic that are linked and super helpful. And you can see how they used like the boxes. So like our resources and SF funds, here's what we will use it for, what we hope to achieve, and then they have their outcomes broken up. And then it goes into all these different categories of resources. This is a theory of change for a research practice partnership that we have with our local school district, funded by the William T. Grant Foundation. Nicole Patton-Terry is the PI. And so this is focused on what are the partners going to be investing. So we have, what do we need to operate Leon County Schools, the school district? These are things that they are committing to. The Florida Center for Reading Research, these are the resources they're committing to, right? And then we have partners and funding. And then the activities and outputs are related to, broken down into research and project goals, which then you'll notice that we've acknowledged that there's administrative support needed for these things to happen. And I think that's a common oversight maybe of early career grant writers, is not acknowledging the like infrastructural things that have to be in place to make these projects happen. And so then from the outcomes, it's just focused on research, partner engagement, innovations and engagement, right? And then the school district and the university researchers came together to agree on these external factors and assumptions. Here is another great example of a logic model. This was shared by Dr. Julie Thompson at Texas A&M for a OSEP 325D that was published or funded. And so you can see here what her project goal is: preparing these scholars to become faculty in special ed. And so when we think about that's the goal, what then are the outcomes that you would want to be able to quantify or determine that are there? So things like they would have increased knowledge of the research-based practices. They achieve their competencies, right? That's what we want happening as the scholars are progressing through their programs. Intermediate, so what actions do we want them to be able to do? We want them to be able to implement evidence-based practices and teacher preparation. We want to increase the supply of faculty. And then long-term is focused on then what conditions are going to be changed at the society level. She then organized her outputs into activities and participation, right? So rather than having these separate, instead it's just inputs, outputs, outcomes, and then what activities headings fall under it. So I just wanted to highlight that as a different structure that makes total sense. And it also aligns then with an evaluation plan, because you would have project objectives across these outputs and outcomes, and you'd have process measures. So things measuring the process as the grant is going on, and then our outcome measures. Here's another traditional logic model. This is from Project Impact, which was an OSEP model demo grant that Shawnee Wakeman was PI of. And you can see that they have their goals explicitly stated first, and then went into activities, outputs, short-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. So the activities kind of have a implied set of resources that aren't made explicit. So we're going to transition over into talking about a theory of change, but I wanted to see, Matt, if you wanted to add anything into the logic model component.
I just want to say there's some excellent examples of logic models, and a mistake that I made the first time I made one is I kind of started from scratch and did I'll do this my way and figure it out. But I highly recommend if you're gonna, especially if you're gonna go after one of the OSEP awards that you saw a logic model for, steal somebody who did it really well and then adapt it for your own purposes is a really great approach. So you're getting lots of great tools to do that today.
Yeah, totally agree. Work smarter, not harder, especially with things like OSEP and IES. Those are the mechanisms I'm most familiar with. It's, this is not a creative writing activity. It's what I tell my students, like there's a formula and there are expectations, and not all of those are explicitly stated in those very long RFAs. And so reaching out to others who have been funded, or you can also learn from not funded, I think is really helpful. And we have a really supportive community within DADD, and then, and friends, those others of you who are joining us. So I would say don't hesitate to reach out to someone and just ask if they'd be willing to share or give feedback to you. And I think it's wonderful that, Matt, you have your students do this early on and then continually revise. So I would say to students, even if that's not a requirement in your program, there's no reason you can't just do it, right? So moving into theory of change, we talked about how logic model is descriptive, right? It's just that series of if-then statements. A theory of change, though, is explanatory, and so it's going to have those causal mechanisms identified. So it is a type of logic model that shows the big picture and including the issues you can't control. Maybe that's part of my favorite aspect of it is, that we're going to acknowledge everything in this universe impacting the outcome that we want to achieve. And we're going to realize there are some things that we can control and can't. There are some things we can manipulate, but aren't going to. And so then that gives you sort of a pathway for all the different ways or series of actions that might lead to change in that outcome that you want, even if it's not related to your program or service. We can use a theory of change to describe the how and why you think change is happening versus logic models. It's just the what change is happening. You can describe why you think one will lead to another, such as like a theoretical grounding, an assumption you have. Do you have evidence to show that is the case? So it can guide how you describe the work you do. Grant proposal narratives for research grants are generally going to be a theory of change. Your dissertation lit review can also include this. It's reflected in your research plan. So your theory of change should align with your research plan and your timeline of activities. There should be synergy and alignment between them, but it's going to evolve based on findings. I actually was going to put up, it may be in here somewhere, I can't remember, but the theory of change from my IES early career proposal. I think it looks great, but COVID happened in my first year. So like whole new factors got added in and things got taken away. But I heard an IES program officer in a call say that we see the theory of change as crucial to a successful application. And I would also echo that from my own experience on IES grant review panels. And I think Matt would as well.
Yeah, that's like the first thing that I look at is I flip through to the theory of change, read through it, and whether or not I can quickly make sense of what is written both in the narrative and in the diagram really shapes the way that I view the rest of the proposal. Because if that's communicated super clearly early on, it's just going to shape the review to be more positive. Because this is a really well-organized proposal. It's well thought out, and it's going to be easy for me to make sense of the rest of the proposal also. So I think it's part of putting your best foot forward in a proposal.
Yeah, I completely agree that, giving your reviewers a schema, to like kind of start with, you're introducing them to your approach to this problem. You're convincing them that there even is a problem, that the problem is worth studying. everyone is going to have a different set of background knowledge and expectations for what's in your application. And so being really specific and having alignment between what you said and what you're doing, and not having some like random other thing that nobody ever mentioned, will make it much easier for reviewers.
Some advice that I've gotten that I've taken is, in a lot of proposals, like for IES, there's the option that you can slide your theory of change into an appendix in the back. And the advice I've always gotten is like, make space for it in the main narrative so nobody has to flip to find it. And I think that advice has served me well. And when I'm a reviewer, even though they're allowed to put in the appendix, there's a split second of annoyance, like, oh, now I gotta go hunt for it, right? So anything you can do to make it easier for reviewers and to put the conceptual piece up front and center, I think is smart.
Yeah, I agree too, especially with everything being a PDF, and then be like, oh, let me find like, you know, yes. You want, and this would be like a whole grant, how to make a grant reviewer happy when you're writing. That could be like a whole other webinar, is you never know what, like, where, what mood, you know, what's going to be going on, how much time they're giving to this. You want to make it as simple as possible. So I'm going to go through what some components of a theory of change might look like. I used to call this the Rob Horner way, but it's the IES single case research design institute way. Any of you who've gone through that training, this is what we were given. If you have not had a chance to go through that training, one of the resources we have linked is a series of videos from Rob Horner and Wendy Mihalacek going through this. So many of the videos from the 2017 Institute, which is actually the one that Matt and I both went to, are contained there. So that's another great resource. Just want to make sure I'm always giving appropriate credit. But just as with a logic model, you want to begin with your socially valid outcomes. Like, so what are we trying to achieve? This might start long. We might start with some writing exercises and thinking about why this is what I want to happen. But then eventually we want it to become short and to the point. And what exactly is it that you want to happen? That is your dependent variable. So if like, this is the outcome I want, you need to be able to measure that outcome. Then we identify the malleable variables or the core variables. So what does research say impacts that outcome? So we get that out of our literature reviews. So I will use the example I'm most comfortable with, and that's math word problem solving. So if the socially valid outcome that I'm looking for is increased generalization of word problem solving abilities for students with autism and intellectual disability. Well, if I go into the research, what are some of these malleable variables, these things that if I hold them, you know, away and then put them in place, I am likely to get a causal effect, or at least have the opportunity to determine that. So things like schema-based instruction, technology supports, and generalization activities as 3. But then we need to identify, like, none of these things happen within a vacuum. Like, wouldn't that be easier? But they don't. Most of us do research like with people in real places, and we need to identify what that context is and be explicit about it. So what are things within that context that might influence those variables? So for example, opportunities to learn math. Does the class even have math 5 days a week? Many, it's only 2 or 3. Students' past learning experiences, right? We can't control for that, but we should account for it. The teacher's level of comfort or self-efficacy with teaching math. So those types of things you might want to identify. And then finally, we back out, because that's also not all happening within a vacuum. There are outside, we can call on societal values or setting conditions that are influencing that context and those variables. And they also are influencing why we care about this bigger outcome. So if we take the example of math word problem solving, what are some of the setting conditions or societal values? One is increased expectations and opportunities for students with intellectual disability and autism, right? Another is the Supreme Court ruling in Andrew that they need to have appropriately ambitious goals. Another is school accountability measures, right? Because word problem solving is accounted for there. So we can think about these sort of aspects that are driving the overall why we've selected this and why we've determined this to be socially valid, as well as the other components. So some benefits is it defines what's held constant, because we could have all these malleable variables, but we're only going to do one of them. It provides foundations for adaptations. So like, oh, that didn't work or didn't work for some, I can continually revise. It improves your precision of your research questions, guides your measurement. And also it's important that it becomes really clear that you have cascading logic, which I'll go over here. So cascading logic is basically assuming that a change that impacts one group is going to just magically affect another group. So for example, I'm going to train teachers in in academic vocabulary. And then now the students are all going to have higher vocabulary scores. Like, well, not necessarily, but that's an assumption that's being made. So in cascading logic in your logic model, if you think about what your outcome is, your primary outcome, if your primary intervention is teacher training, the primary outcome that you're measuring needs to be a change in teacher level behavior. And then you're making an assumption that a change in teacher level behavior is going to change student level behavior. And your project could address both. But it just needs to be really specific. I am going to go to this example because that's really similar to the ones I talked through. So this is from Taryn Wade and her dissertation. And so the big outcome that she was seeking was math-related expressive language, defined as shape attributes, and then examples of shapes. And then she has sort of two buckets or categories of malleable variables: shared reading, and then here's the different components within shared reading that could be adapted, and then enrichment activities. What you can see here is her dissertation was only looking at these factors, leaving the other ones on the table, acknowledging they're there, that you could do it, but leaving it on the table. And then she's identified the contextual variables and the setting conditions. Here's an example of cascading logic being acknowledged. And this was a not funded grant. I think it's almost as important to share and normalize not being funded as it is funded. And so our goal was that special education teachers would be able to use EBPs to teach math, and that they would have a high self-efficacy for teaching math. Our assumption was that that might lead to student outcomes, but we weren't measuring that or controlling for that. And we did that through this research practice partnership. So, I mean, you can get some use of color coding, dashed lines, shapes. So I hope you can start to see how the choices that you make should not be because it looks good, though it needs to look good. But also there needs to be some intentionality behind it, like green plus yellow. I mean, blue plus yellow is green, right? I've got all the aspects within what we were proposing identified. And now Matt is going to talk to us about some additional considerations in our format and structure.
So I'm going to start out by talking about moderators and mediators, and hopefully none of you have eyes, glaze over when you hear that, because those can get pretty boring if you get down into the weeds and the math. I'm not going to do that. We're just going to talk conceptually today. I'm also going to say that give a plug for the cluster randomized design training by IES, which is a separate training from the single case design. I've been to both. Both are excellent. If you do cluster randomized design, you're going to get a much heavier dose on moderators and mediators when you think about theory of change. What I'm going to do my best today to do is kind of back out, talk at these in a conceptual way, and actually give examples both in group design and in single case design, because I think it's helpful to think about both that way. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is moderators. Jenny actually already gave a great segue to moderators earlier when she was talking about like, what are the things that we can't change that are not malleable? Like, should we still be including those? Jenny, if you can advance that slide one.
Yeah. Just let me know.
By definition, moderators can actually sometimes be malleable, but if you're considering a moderator in your research study or your program of research, you're really thinking about it as something you're not going to change. And when you think about this, you're thinking about for whom under what circumstances might something work. So this is something in your research that you might measure at the pretest at the beginning, but the idea is it's not going to change over time. It's set once you've measured it at the beginning. I'm going to give several examples, and then I'll kind of walk you through what it would look like with specific research studies. If you can back up to that one, I'm sorry, Jane, I'm going to walk through the bottom there. So one example from one of my colleagues work here at Ohio State, Helen Malone, she's done a ton of work around video modeling and video prompting. And some of you in the room here know more about those things than I do. But the idea being that students with less intensive support needs can be super successful with video models, where I show you a bunch of steps in a multi-step routine all at once, and then you go complete all of those steps after you watch the video model. But for students with more intensive support needs, that's not going to work. Maybe I show you one step, then you do that one step, and then you return back to the video. So the idea there with Helen's work is the moderator is how significant your support needs are, or by proxy, maybe IQ. That the higher the IQ, the more successful you'll be with video modeling, the more significant your impairment is. You might need video prompting instead of video modeling. Other kinds of examples, I'm going to skip to the third one there. It's kind of from my own work. I do a lot of peer mediated interventions. And my hypothesis for moderation is that kiddos that are on the spectrum that have the most significant autism symptoms are going to be the hardest to reach through peer-mediated intervention. And part of that is just because we train these peers to do all these cool things. If you interact with somebody on the spectrum, that their first reaction is to run away from you or tell you no, or to have a physical reaction, it's harder for peers to break through. It takes a longer period of time. Certainly can still work, and we can do some things around that, but often it's going to take longer to see those effects over time. So those are examples of things that we can't change, but we know impact the efficacy of an intervention. Next, I want to talk a little bit about mediation. Mediation, in contrast, and you go, awesome, you're already there. In contrast is things that we are trying to change. And the idea here is we're changing it during the course of our research, and that in turn is actually going to change the outcome that we're going to want to see in kids. We've already seen some examples of this because Jenny was already talking about cascading logic models, right? So that actually is a mediation model where the idea is my staff training model should change what teachers or para-educators are doing, and then once we change what they're doing, we should in turn see a change in student outcomes. So that's a great example of that. Other examples that don't involve staff training, one that isn't special ed that I have on here is that if you want to improve your cardiovascular health, we know that you can do that by wearing a Fitbit, but that's not a straight chain, right? So wearing a Fitbit makes you motivated to take more steps. And taking more steps in turn, increasing your exercise lowers your risk of cardiovascular disease. There's something there in the middle that actually explains things. I won't spend much time at all going to formulas or math, but just to think conceptually, those of you who are quant folks, moderators, you can put those in as regular predictors, covariates, into your regression model. Mediators, you're going to have to handle differently and actually run in a special mediation model because they're not handled just as regular predictors because you're expecting a change and that to be a change in something else. Some people actually run two separate models where, like, does my teacher training make teachers implement this better? Cool. And when teachers implement this better, second model, does it impact the outcomes I want to see on kids? So conceptually different. Cool. Next couple slides. This is a path diagram of mediation. I'm actually just going to skip this and move on. I do want to talk a little bit about how moderation and mediation can actually play out in different designs. 99% of the time, you hear people talk about this stuff only for group design. because that's where you can make things work in a regression model. But the reason why I highlighted my colleague Helen Malone's work in video modeling and video prompting is to show you how you actually can embed that into some models in single case design. So in this case, her theory is that students with more intensive support needs are going to be more successful with video prompting than video modeling. So what she's done here, she actually has a comparative design where within each tier, she's randomized whether you get video prompting or video modeling for 2 different tasks. And these are all students with more significant support needs. The hypothesis is if she's right, if the moderation model is working here and students with more significant disabilities need a different intervention in video modeling, then we should always see video prompting, you see video prompting always be the one they're more successful with, and video modeling should be the one that they're less successful with. And what you see here is that plays out exactly, right? So we're answering that question of for whom and for under what circumstances. In this case, the for whom is students with more significant disabilities, and the intervention that's a better fit for them is video prompting rather than video modeling. So that's an example from single case design. Deidre, you are awesome throwing the links up that fast. That's incredible. I need to hire you for other things that I
No, can't have her.
Next
you can.
example,
She'll be graduating next year.
Got it. Given the time, I'm actually going to skip that group design example. Some of you probably will thank me with all the bubbles that are there. It takes me too long to talk through it. Here's another example from my own work that actually is the idea is a cascading treatment model because I'm focused on training paraeducators. This actually is for my early career award. So the idea is that multi-tier PD is what I'm thinking about as the intervention that's going to impact what parapros are doing. That's going to change their implementation fidelity, in this case of systematic prompting, and that in turn is going to have an impact on student outcomes. So the mediator there is paraeducator implementation fidelity, how well they're implementing what we're training them to do. At the same time, there's also moderators that I'm not doing anything to change to have an impact. So you have paraeducator characteristics up there. I had all these cool ideas about paraeducator moderators that I tested that I thought I would find something. I thought if we had like paraeducators that are fresh, starting out in the field, they would be more malleable. We could train them faster, and people who have been in the field 20 years would be harder to train. None of that bore out at all. Turns out anybody that buys into your training, that you can get them to kind of buy in and give it a shot, they were equally good and acquire things just as quickly. So I was actually glad that that didn't pan out. It taught me that we can reach anybody if we use high quality training. Just an example of having explicit mediators and moderators.
I love to make the connection and show, there's various ways to demonstrate or communicate these aspects, because I could see in a different arrangement that the professional characteristics and student characteristics you consider as contextual variables, right? But here it sounds much fancier. No. And depending on the test you're running, it makes sense to classify them that way.
Yeah, it just totally depends on whether you can measure them and include them in your model. Mm-hmm. I feel like if you can, and you can actually control for that and test for whether that has an impact, then it takes you a step further. Not only is it contextual, but it's telling you what role are different contextual variables playing. Agreed. Mm-hmm. I'm going to talk quickly because we're getting close to out of time, and then I'll let you take over from here, Jenny, wrap up this section. Is the idea of proximal and distal outcomes. This is a conceptual idea that actually kind of dovetails with things that we've already talked about. In a nutshell, proximal outcomes are things that are really tightly aligned with the intervention. And I stole this from another researcher, Shane Piasta, who said she stole it from someone else whose name I don't know. This idea of bespoke measures, which if you do single case design, that's what you do is bespoke measures, right? Like you design a specialized measure that's tightly aligned with what you're doing. So if you do single case work, then what you're measuring in your graphing is going to be a proximal outcome. Because you're thinking, I'm going to see a change, bam, I'm going to be able to see that through visual analysis. Distal outcomes are things that are probably not going to fit well in a single case design to see effects quickly, but they are the kind of things that funders want to see. So funders say, oh, great, they learned those specific vocabulary words in your single case design, but did you raise their Woodcock-Johnson score? Or did you raise their state testing score at the end of the year. And those things are much harder to improve, but those are kind of rubber hits the road things that people care about for accountability. So I'll stop there for the sake of time, but both of those things are important. And usually if you're going for fun, you're going to include both of those things in your model.
Yeah, that's a great point about, when you're identifying your outcomes, of like the outcomes you want to see, but then you have to also think about like the outcomes other people want or need to see, right? So here is another example of just what that looks like in a hybrid of everything we've been talking about so far. This is from Veronica Fleury's funded IES grant. And so she does have her sort of the resources and activities, but then within the activities, you can see the theory of change, right? It has the professional development, improves fidelity of, and the different components, right? And so directly hoping to develop that proximal measure of meaning focused literacy and code focused, and then has this distal outcome, which I love this arrow. The distal outcome is what like wraps it all back up. So I love how simple and clean this is, but it really communicates what the project was. For time, I'm going to skip through the implementation science slides. I just want you to know they're more complex. That would be TLDR.
Yeah, essentially everything we talked about up to this point can mostly fit in determinants and within the implementation science. So it's like you're zooming out a lot for implementation science.
Yes. But that is helpful because implementation science and those efforts are complex. And so the field has really worked to identify what those complexities are. So we're going to wrap up in our last 5 minutes with so you want to build a model and write about it and talk about it and get funded. So ideally, you're going to be developing that model as soon as possible within your initial conceptualization and project planning stages, because it's outlining your plan of work and your outcomes. And so it provides a very nice space for everyone involved to co-construct that. You want to distribute it widely, right? And that it's an iterative process. And then as you're going through, you want to have it front and center throughout the grant or project, adapt it as necessary, because it's only going to be as useful as it is accurate. As you develop that logic model, again, the William Kellogg Foundation resource is wonderful for walking you through some of these things, but you want to think about what are those results? What's that big outcome that you're chasing? What activities are going to produce it? Either if it's quantified X number of teachers trained, or if it's this like growth in standardized test scores, and then what resources are going to be needed. There are 3 general approaches. I have obviously emphasized here start at the end approach of what's going to be different and for whom, like what's the change you wish to see in the world, right? And then work backwards. There is a backwards and forwards. I think that's probably realistic too. You have your long-term outcomes, then what steps, specify if then, or starting with resources, and sometimes this happens when a foundation reaches out to you and says, hey, we have this money and we want to do this thing. And so you might start with that aspect. It's also important to know that funders may recommend formats. So you should use those. Or if previous people have been funded, use those. So for example, foundations like the United Way, Kellogg Foundation's probably going to want you to use theirs. Annie Casey Foundation also has one, William T. Grant, that aren't going to be all that different. But again, we want to make the review process as easy as possible, and you want to be able to use it to communicate with them. Here is an OSEP logic model that I found on some presentation on their website from some time. And so if those of you who are in that season right now, this might be helpful. And finally, some general recommendations. Don't assume that anything in your diagram is as intuitive to you as it is to the reader. I would also say, don't assume anything in your grant or in your research paper or in your dissertation, right? You want to keep it simple and specific. Make sure we have alignment, and we want to orient the reader to sort of the big ideas before we get down into the weeds, which is like our passion to nerd out about, right? But you may have lost others. All right. And we are going to end there. I think we are right at noon. We have these resources, but again, if you know of other resources that you would like to share with the group broadly, please send them either via the chat or email to Deidre, and then we will post the link to these slides for everyone.
Yes. So as we transition out of here, I know we are a couple seconds away from 12 o'clock, but just a couple things to share for you guys. If you'll give us a few days to get together this resource, I will share it out, as I mentioned in the chat, to the listserv of people that registered for today. Just keep an eye out on your emails for that. I also want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Root and Dr. Brock for taking the time to develop this presentation today and their time today. It was invaluable. The recording will be accessible on Dad's YouTube channel, so I want to show that. So this was sponsored and put on by the Division of Autism and Developmental Disabilities, which is a sub-organization under the Council for Exceptional Children, if you are unfamiliar with it. But we have a ton of great resources on our YouTube channel. You can see that our first part of this webinar series was posted there. If you weren't able to attend, you can go check that out. But that is where I will be posting this webinar that you can access and share out and refer back to for the future. Things don't typically leave that YouTube channel, so I think it will be there for the long haul for you to access. And then just to do a quick plug, this is part 2 of a 4-part webinar series that I'm leading, with the next 2 coming up in September and December. Those dates have not been set yet because that, while it's right around the corner, that still is a little ways away. We have some great speakers for those talks, one of which will be about the job search process, and then another one about early career across the field. So not just tenure track positions, not just clinical faculty positions, but other positions that are available out there for those that are in the early career phases of your career or are students who would like to learn a little bit more about that process. Keep an eye out for that information to come. But again, thank you, Dr. Root. Thank you, Dr. Brock. Please email me if you do have any additional resources or questions. But it's 12:01 and I want to respect your time. I hope you have a great Monday and a great rest of your week. Thank you, guys.